All right, so this is for our class on angels and demons, spiritual gifts, and miracles. I'm only going to give one lecture on miracles, and I'm only going to cover one of Jesus' miracles. So the passage that I'm going to be looking at for this lecture is from John chapter 2. This is Jesus's miracle at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, and this is the only lecture I'm going to give on miracles, but I'll tell you why I chose this miracle. There are two reasons why I chose this miracle, and I've taught this class for a few years now, and um, in spite of my temptation to talk more about miracles, I've retained just this one lecture because I think it's a good way to whet the appetite for miracles, particularly miracles in the New Testament that Jesus performed. So there's two reasons why I chose this passage. So first of all, this miracle in John chapter 2, this wedding, this changing the water into wine at a wedding, is Jesus's first public miracle. Now, we say public because we don't know the extent to which he may have performed miracles in the presence of his family. We don't know. We don't know if Jesus was, turning water to wine, as a 13-year-old, or, they were playing outside and broke a window and he fixed the window miraculously or whatever, right? Like, we don't know the extent to Jesus that Jesus did other miracles. So we say public miracle. So it's his first miracle, so it's worth looking at. But really, even more than that, is I think that this miracle gives us insight into all of the other miracles that he performed. I think that this is foundational, I believe, to Jesus's ministry. So let's read John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And I am reading from the ESV. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you to do." Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. That's important. Each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now, draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So here's the setting. Let's look at the setting of this passage. Let's exegete this passage. If you're going to write a paper on this passage, you would start with setting. So it was a wedding, and it's important culturally for us to understand that weddings in the first century looked a little different, a lot different than a 21st century American wedding. Weddings in this culture typically were 6 days, because on the 7th was the Sabbath. They were planned out over the course of about 12 months. So you had a 12-month engagement. So typically, when two people became engaged, the woman was considered the wife and the man was considered the husband. They just had not consummated the marriage yet. But at the engagement, they are committed to each other. If you remember the story of Mary getting pregnant, talking to Joseph, Joseph said he's just going to put his wife away privately, even though they weren't married yet, right? Hadn't been married yet. So these weddings took about a year to plan, and you solicited help from various people in the community to help you with it. But what you planned for was you planned for the number of people you're going to have, how much food you needed, how much wine you needed. They were, people typically lived in villages, so the entire village would come. And you have people from out of town that would come. So they were very expensive and very elaborate affairs. And so it seems it's really reasonable that Jesus and his disciples were invited, because Jesus's family might have been friends with the bride or groom, because his mother was there, or possibly even there. Maybe she had a role to play in the festivities. So the jars in this narrative served to provide water for ceremonial cleansing. Now let's talk about ceremonial cleansing, what that is. So these pots held water, which the participants of the wedding over the course of 6 days would use to wash their hands. So according to Levitical law, these jars would have been carved out of stone, which takes a long time, right? So they weren't clay fixed on a kiln. They were stone. You took a big stone and you hammer out a jar, and they held around 20 or 30 gallons. So this was extremely heavy, right? Because water weighs 8 pounds a gallon. So you're looking at, 240 pounds of water plus a stone. So that's a big container. So these jars would have been filled with water, and they would have been put in high traffic areas, like out in the places where everyone was celebrating the wedding, so that the Jews could constantly cleanse themselves, wash their hands in this water during this week-long festivities. So very dirty water. It's water that you wash your hands with, right? Now, it would have been really embarrassing in that culture for the host of the wedding to make invitations, prepare, and then run out of wine, because you had a year to prepare this. So if you run out of wine, it would have been an embarrassment for the groom, the family, the bride. So it was really kind of a big deal, right? It would be trying to think of something similar in a wedding that we have today. It would almost be like you have a year to plan your wedding. You send out invitations, and then people RSVP, and you say, okay, I'm going to have 150 people at my wedding, and you see the cake, and the cake is big enough to feed 70 people. It would be really embarrassing for the entire family, right? So Mary had a role to play in this wedding, but she also had a role to play in this miracle. So a lot of people, it's been a significant concern for people, because the way Jesus spoke to Mary. Mary comes to Jesus and says, hey, you're out of wine. In verse 4, Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour's not yet come. Seems really abrupt. Like maybe his response to her doesn't match what she said to him. Almost feels like overkill a little bit. But maybe she had an interest because of the role she was playing. Maybe she had a specific role to play in the wedding, and she maybe had inside information. Hey, they're almost out of wine. But through this, she was concerned for the host, but she also saw an opportunity for Jesus. This is Jesus's earthly mother that sees an opportunity for Jesus to display who he really is. So he says, my time has not yet come. When Jesus says, woman, what does this to do with me? my hour has not yet come, he is referring to his time on the cross when he would be the propitiation for the sins of humanity. There are multiple times in the Gospels when Jesus says that his hour or his time has not yet come, but finally, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's arrested, he says the hour is at hand. So that language, making sure that we're on board with what's happening at this wedding. There's a wedding, there's a lot of preparation, everybody's having a good time, they're almost out of wine. Mary comes to Jesus. Hey, they don't have any wine. She's concerned about the host, she's concerned about the guest, but she also sees an opportunity for Jesus to reveal himself. And Jesus says, it's not time for the ultimate reason I'm here yet. But then clearly he agrees, because Mary looks at the servants and says, do whatever he tells you to do. So a side note here, he says the hour is at hand when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is just a side note on Gethsemane. This is not something you need to remember for this class necessarily, but maybe if you ever preach or teach on Gethsemane, what happened in the garden. When Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says to the Father, Father, if there's any other way, if there be any other way. There's been a lot of ways people have tried to understand what Jesus was saying. And a very popular way of trying to understand what Jesus is saying when he says, Father, if there's any other way, is to say Jesus is asking the Father's permission to escape what's in front of him. Like, Father, if there's any other way. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus isn't asking for absolution from the task that's ahead of him. He's saying, Father, if there's another way for people to be forgiven of their sins permanently and to take on your righteousness, then do that. If there's another way, if people can be good enough on their own, then let this cup pass. If the 5 pillars of Islam are adequate, then let this pass. If the 8-fold path in Buddhism is good enough, then let this cup pass. If there's any other way for people to be reconciled to God other than through my torture and murder, let this cup pass. So he's not saying, God, deliver me from this. He's saying, Father, if there's another way for people to be forgiven and brought into your family and reconciled to you, then do that. But obviously, there is no better way. Jesus is the better way. So that's just a little side note on Gethsemane. All right, let's talk about the miracle in John chapter 2. So you have the miracle, but I think the big question we want to ask when studying this or any other miracle is, what's the significance of it? Why do it? And so why did Jesus choose this as his first public miracle? What's he trying to communicate through what seems to be almost an insignificant miracle? First, it's important to understand that we call it a miracle, but what does John 2:11 call it? He says, this is the first of his signs. In the Gospel of John, John refers to Jesus' miracles as signs, meaning that they are significant. They're pointing to something, right? So this is what a sign means. We understand that this is a sign, then we have more insight into Jesus' other signs, right? So if the miracle here at Cana is a sign pointing to something, and we can understand what it's pointing to, then maybe we can understand the other signs / miracles and what they point to that Jesus did. And secondly, when the Gospels talk about a sign, They're saying that Jesus is pointing to something else. So what is this pointing to? Why did Jesus do this miracle? It all starts with the jars. So the jars are very important to this story. The jars of water didn't exist just to wash the dirt from the guests' hands. The water was provided for ceremonial cleansing or purification. Verse 6 says, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. So this wasn't just about sanitation. This was about religious purification. So the water was provided for ceremonial cleansing or purification. And ceremonial cleansing is an act of using water as a means to symbolize an inner purification. So if you can imagine, so they didn't just dip their hands in it and rub them together like off. They would typically dip the water and let it run over their hands because it was ceremonial, but it was washing the dirt off their hands. And as the water's poured over the hand, it symbolizes the work. So that's what the jars were for. The jars were for helping people to constantly be reminded that the law brings purification. So the sign that Jesus did was that he turned that ceremonial water into wine. So Jesus's first public sign was pointing to the redemptive work he would do on the cross. He chose water pots that have been used for a week by guests to wash their hands and face. The water wasn't clean, the pots weren't clean. He chose water that was used to symbolize an outward sign of an inward change that was brought by obedience to the law. He took those dirty pots used to symbolize the law, and he transformed the contents to the finest wine anyone had ever seen. The miracle, or the sign, was Jesus' way of pointing to what his entire existence and ministry was about, which was replacing the rituals and ordinances of the law with a supernatural inner transformation that only his redemptive work could bring. The ceremonial cleansing of the water was meant to push holiness in from the outside. The redemptive work of Jesus is meant to push holiness out from the inside. The water turned into wine at Cana was a complete picture of the gospel of Jesus, meaning that your efforts to be clean in God's eyes are not nearly as effective as a miracle that only Jesus could do, which is to change the quality of the water through a miracle. And so the significance then of Jesus's miracle at Cana of Galilee is his very first miracle, or as John calls it, a sign. His very first sign was to point to the reason that he came and the reason he was born. And so I mentioned earlier that if we can understand this sign, then it'll give us insight into all of Jesus's other signs or miracles. And so for the remainder of your ministry, when you read through the New Testament and you read about a miracle that Jesus does, whether it's this or, raising Lazarus, or the woman who was healed with the bleeding, whatever the miracle, I want you to begin to see these miracles through the lens of the gospel. Specifically, when you read a miracle that Jesus performs, how does that miracle tell the story of why Jesus came? Because John says there's signs, not just miracles. So what that means then is it means that every person that was healed, every person that was fed with, bread and fish, walking on water, Peter walking on water, sinking, and then having to be raised back up, Every miracle tells something about the gospel story. And so rather than do several lectures on miracles to help you understand miracles, what I would rather do is point to Jesus's first miracle, explain it, so that now moving forward, rather than you wondering what each miracle means, you can begin to read the miracles of Jesus through the lens of the gospel. So Jesus' mission was the cross, and his entire ministry makes a profound statement after profound statement about his redemptive work, both now and in eternity. So before I really understood this miracle in Cana of Galilee, I really didn't, it really didn't make sense to me. Well, why that miracle and why then? It just seems to be, okay, he can do miracles. Maybe that was the significance. He can just do miracles. But as it turns out, what Jesus was saying, and it gets so much deeper than this, and I really don't have time to get into it, but I found it fascinating that the people that he chose to reveal himself to first were his disciples and some servants. The thing about servants is the Greek word for servant is the same as the Greek word for slave. Doulos, that's the word. And context tells you whether it means slave or whether it means servant. So these servants could have been, they could have been full-on slaves. They could have been bond servants, meaning they had sold themselves into the care of this family to pay off debt, or maybe they were just, lowly paid wait staff. Either way, when Jesus decided to do a miracle to point to his ultimate ministry here on earth, he did it in front of his mother, his disciples, and slaves, not in front of the master of the ceremony, not in front of the bride and the bridegroom, not in front of all the people there to celebrate. He did it to the lowest, really, the lowest people first. And I find that fascinating, and you can explore maybe why he did that at some other point in your ministry, but I always think it's really interesting. But that's how I see miracles in the New Testament. And even when you start to view miracles in the Old Testament, to help think about what redemptive action God is trying to highlight. I think that's a good way to understand miracles. That's a good way to understand miracles today, when people are healed today, people are set free today. What does that say about God and his redemptive story? So the other thing that this means, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that if that's how we're to understand miracles, if we are to understand miracles as signs pointing to the redemptive work of Jesus, then that means every person that is divinely healed, or every person that is divinely set free from addiction or whatever, is not just for that person's freedom, not just so that that person can be healed, not even though certainly in God's sovereignty and his wisdom, he heals whomever he wants, right? But the bigger point is, if you hear a testimony about someone being healed or someone being delivered from something, then what does that testimony tell you about the gospel of Jesus, which is the point? I think that's the point. So maybe that's why everyone's not healed. Maybe not, but maybe that's why everyone's not healed, because God is doing it in a way that constantly points to him. Because if everyone was healed all the time, I can tell you what humans would do. Humans would get used to it, they would expect it, and then they would complain about it, which is exactly what the children of Abraham did in the desert after they had crossed the Red Sea. They got water from a rock and manna from heaven every day, and they complained about it, right? That's what people will do after they get something for so long. So maybe that's why everyone's not healed all the time. But it points to God's redemptive work, not just what God did, not just what Jesus did, but the healing that we receive here on the other side of the cross points to that ultimate healing that we will all experience when we are changed in the twinkling of an eye. So anyway, so that's my 2 cents on miracles, starting with the wedding at Cana in Galilee. You got any questions for me? I'm gonna stop recording. Thank you for tuning in, for you guys that are watching on YouTube, and I'm gonna stop the recording.